The test is not chosen by the reader, but is imposed. So it is different in that aspect. The response, we want an observable response. The scoring rules must be conformed to the task. If I have an item, I want the scoring rules to reflect what I'm after. So the scoring rules are part of the validity. And the score is in fact the inverse of the difference between the task and the response. If I set this task and the response is here, then that is the difference between the task and the response that is expressed in the score. Let's look at ability in reading and listening. So ability is, of course, the ability to recognize and relate linguistic elements that are presented in a text. It is the ability to grasp the concepts that are in the text. If the text is about some esoterical philosophical subject, maybe I have difficulty reading the text because I don't understand the concepts. The ability is also the ability to understand the task. Sometimes students don't even understand what they have to do with an item. And the ability is the ability to solve the task. And finally, to provide a response. So now let's go and look at the structural model of language ability. Within the Common European Framework, we distinguish two basic dimensions, a quantity dimension and a quality dimension. And the quantity is about how many different things a person can do in a language, how many different circumstances he can deal with, how many different functions he can deal with. And the quality is about several functions, several tasks can be performed at different levels of quality. I can go into the cafe and ask beer, and I will get 2 beer. But that quality is, of course, less than if you go into the cafe and say, please may I have 2 pints of beer. So those are the 2 elements that constitute quality. If we combine them, then we can have a system of levels. I used to talk about the system of levels as a ladder. That is a wrong image. The image is more like a slippery slope on a mountain. When you're climbing a mountain, you are with one hand up and with one leg down, so your listening ability may be higher than your speaking ability. It is a slippery slope. It is a continuum. You can go up the mountain and you can slide back down again. Another aspect that people seem to forget when they talk about levels of ability is that at the lower level, communication may be very difficult. So at the lower level, at A1 or below A1, you have very little language, and the language that you have may be different from a language that somebody else has. Though you're learning the same language, you know the word for table, and the other one knows the word for spoon. Can you communicate? No, because this one doesn't know spoon and this one doesn't know table. So as you grow in ability, you cover more and more of the language, and you get more common language. And in the end, when you're very high level of ability, your language areas overlap. Some people think it is different. Jong of the other university in Amsterdam, he keeps on saying that at higher level people differentiate their language. Well, it's not true, because where they differentiate is only in maybe a very tiny area of the language, which is their specific subject area. For example, psychometrics. Some people know these words in psychometrics, some people know these words in biology. But that is only a very tiny part of the total usage of language that they have. So as people grow, they cover more and more of the language and are more and more in common. This is how 2 people grow in language ability. And if they grow up to the level of C2, there is practically 100% overlap between the languages that they know. Because the definition of C2 is that you can do anything in the language. Yeah? So it must be a complete overlap with somebody else who can do anything in the language. The small area that is not overlapping the subject-specific area is relatively very small. It is even smaller than the total of, for example, A1. Another thing that people need to know is that all language in the concept of the CEF is partial. There is even a mother tongue speaker, a native speaker, doesn't know the complete language. So the C2 level is in fact a virtual level. It is something that people strive towards, but is never reached. There are exams at C2, but there are no candidates at C2. And I doubt whether those exams, which are at C2, are actually really at C2. How can you ever test somebody at C2? It is impossible. Jong, one of the main authors of the CEF, says, I don't speak English at C2. Another aspect, language is profiled. So you can have your speaking ability maybe different from your reading ability. So when you say somebody is C2 or B2, what do you mean? Is he universal B2 or does he have speaking ability at B2? Well, we must take that into account. Somebody can have extraordinary speaking skills, overflowing, and be 0 in writing. That is possible. Many native speakers are. So let's look at how language ability increases along the slippery slope. So we have some learners on the slope, and we have some learners coming in late. And we have also a learner that loses a bit of language. All those things happen. Now, to help us understand the differences between these learners, Brian Moos did a project in Switzerland to come up with a set of descriptors. So those little arrows are descriptors along the slippery slope. They all have different values along the slippery slope. Okay, but if you have 620 descriptors, it is not easy to understand where somebody is if you give him one descriptor. So, what was done also was to say, well, let's put some arbitrary stakes along the mountain, saying this is halfway up, this is 1/3 up, etc. Note that those boundaries are arbitrary. They have no intrinsic meaning. They are just to be able to talk about where you are on the mountain. When you have levels, there is always a level below the lowest level. So you see A1 minus. Now look at these 3 candidates. Candidate 1, candidate 2, and candidate 3. Candidate 1 and 2 are, according to the model, the structural model, they are at the same level, A2. And candidate 3 is at a higher level, B1. But the difference between candidate 2 and 3 is much smaller than the difference between candidate 1 and 2. And those are things that people constantly forget. And you have to have that in mind when you're dealing with the model. Another thing about the model is that there is a hierarchy along different scales that are provided within the Common European Framework. So there is a scale for overall language ability, and overall language ability divides into a number of sub-areas: communicative strategies, communicative language competencies, and communicative activities. And if we look at the communicative activities, they can be subdivided in reception, production, interaction, and mediation. mediation is interpretation and translation. Thing Ilana talked about yesterday also. In the area of interaction, you can have spoken interaction and written interaction. Spoken interaction can be all kinds of different things. Understanding a native speaker, informal discussion, obtaining goods and services. Nowadays in English, the most language that we use in English as learners of English is with other learners of English. We speak more with non-native speakers than we speak with native speakers. In this whole room, I don't know if there is any native speaker. Still, I'm talking English. Why is that? Because I know English and you know English. And that is helpful because then we can talk to each other. But our English is maybe different. But as long as I use an English which is close to some kind of international standard, I will be understood. If I go and speak English in a very strong Dutch accent with all the intonation wrong, then you might have difficulty in understanding me. And that is the target of the language learning, is that we can understand each other. So there is no other standard than the standard that we can understand each other. For each of these areas, there is a scale, which should be a slippery slope, of course. About the quality of language production, there is also a